Hi guys, Mr. King again, and this time the topic of our video lecture is the progressive period. We've already talked about the shame of the cities, political corruption and industrial disorders, and we're going to continue to move forward through the 1890s, really setting up the progressive period, which runs roughly from 1890 to 1920, so about 30 years of history. And today I'm going to start by showing you a picture of one of the progressive presidents. There were three progressive presidents. This is Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, who served from 1901 to 1909. There was William Howard Taft, who served as president from 1909 to 1913. And then there was Woodrow Wilson, who served from 1913 to 1921. So together, this triumvirate, threesome that is, of presidents really led the progressive period. Before we go any farther, I want to start with a brief passage from author Herman Melville and his work Moby Dick, which I think serves as a pretty good introduction to the progressives and their mindset. And I quote, "In the port is safety, comfort, hearthstone, supper, warm blankets, friends, and all that's kind to our mortalities, that is human life. But in that gale, a storm, the port, the land, is that ship's direst jeopardy." End quote. And I think Melville, in this beginning quotation at the very beginning of his novel that just about nobody reads anymore, really kind of frames the attitude that progressives brought to society and to their work. They did not want to remain in the safety of the port, where there were warm blankets and friends and everything that was kind. They really wanted to go out from the port onto the stormy seas, that is that gale and those gale force winds, and they really wanted to directly confront the issues that they felt were seriously challenging the United States and kind of undermining or eroding or corrupting American democracy and the ideals of American democracy. And remember, those ideals, if we've forgotten, really can be found, I think, best stated in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that we all enjoy this life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And the progressives felt that the big business period from 1865 to 1900 had done a lot to produce great wealth, yes, but that wealth was not shared greatly or widely enough, and that many people were living lives of misery and suffering and want. And so the progressive idea is to sort of restore, if you will, democracy and put people back into the picture. So we'll jump right to the end. The progressives really wanted to work towards restoring and reconstructing society by putting people back in the picture and by making the people and by making government the agent or the sort of umpire, if you will, to create this restoration. So I hope that's clear. That's the end. That's the goal of progressives. Let's take a look at a couple of questions that the progressives asked themselves and used to guide their work. Number one, what does it mean to be human? What kind of life do humans live? What kind of lives do humans aspire to? What constitutes a dignified life, a good quality of life? And those are all questions worth asking. What does it mean to know something? The progressives really didn't rely on opinion. They tried very carefully and very rigorously and scientifically to use evidence, and they relied on the new universities and the new disciplines, sociology, for example, history, using facts, amassing facts, and then drawing conclusions from those facts. So the work of the progressives is really going to be based on knowledge. So question 3, what does it mean to be educated, and how do we educate people? That was going to be a big push in the progressives, and that everybody really needed to be educated, because if society is for the people and we live in a democracy, then the people ought to have the ability to make good decisions based on educated ideas, not simply opinions. One wonders the time we're living in today, whether people are making educated choices in our lives, or whether we're relying on the opinions of people who scream the loudest on any number of different media outlets. The last question, what does it mean to change and reform? So the idea is we've got to know something. We've got to know what it means to have a good quality of life, to be a decent human being. We have to know something be educated, and then we have to put all that to use in terms of trying to bring about change to society, to reform, and again, use the word reconstruct American society. So I think that's the goals, the end, and these questions are always present, I think, among the progressive reformers and politicians. So moving forward, let's take a look at the progressives that dominate the political landscape. Here's an actual landscape, though. We learned in class that the political landscape really are different levels of government. So the national government, Washington, D.C., we've got a House of Representatives, we've got a Senate, we've got a president. Then we have the court system as well, the Supreme Court and different levels of federal circuit courts. But at the state level, we have governors, and we have houses of representatives and senates in the state levels, as well as courts. And we have local levels where we might have a mayor, we might have a commission, or a township commission, a county commission, things of that sort. So the progressives, in fact, did dominate the political landscape by running candidates in elections, winning those elections. And once they took office, they were often bold, new ideas, daring, all based on this intellectual study of what do we know, how do we answer the question of what does it mean to be human. And they really put together, I think, this quilt, which is a patchwork of squares that is stitched together to create something of both beauty often and also functionality. Quilts can keep us warm. So what we're looking at then with the progressive movement is using the legislatures, that is, those branches that make laws, to intervene in the economic and social affairs of the United States to produce a quality of life, a standard of living that the progressives deemed more human. And that was the goal, and again, to restore the emphasis on the people of the United States and the United States democracy. So I hope if there are any questions that you will write them down, bring them to class. Love questions. Thank you. So let's move on to the areas of progressive interest. We can see 6 areas: business reforms, political reforms, racial reforms, class reforms, gender reforms, and environmental reforms. Now, I put 3 stars after racial reforms because I feel that that's the area, the category, where the progressives had the least success in bringing about the changes to reconstruct society. In fact, race is going to be one of those thorny issues that really is with the United States throughout the 20th century, that is the 1900s, and into the 21st century, our own century. So those are the areas, and we're going to kind of look through them one by one. And we'll start with business. And the big concern in the area of business was trusts and mergers. Trust, is when heads of companies that do the same thing or make the same product get together and they conspire to set prices, to set production levels, who's going to make what, how much it can be sold for, and this really kind of undermines competition, which is one of those key things in a free market capitalist society. Mergers are when different businesses join together, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, but businesses of the same making the same products will join together and merge. And in the 1890s, there were something like 300 mergers on average per year, but in 1899, one year alone, there were over 1,200 mergers, which suggests that the number of mergers was rapidly accelerating in the United States, which may have been good for the owners of these businesses, the capitalists at will, and stockholders, but was it necessarily good for society, for the workers in particular, and for consumers? And this really caught the attention of early progressives. And a journalist and writer, Ray Stannard Baker, wrote in the 1890s, as a result of all these mergers, that, I quote, "the national blood is out of order," end quote. So he really had problems and saw something that wasn't quite right. The national blood is out of order with regards to these trusts and mergers. Another writer by the name of Henry Demarest Lloyd, and you can see his name there, building off of Henry George's ideas, and we read Henry George, if you remember, Progress and Poverty, and he wrote a work called Wealth Against Commonwealth. So Henry Demarest Lloyd, writing The Wealth Against Commonwealth, argues that, hey, wait a minute, these capitalists have really done a lot of damage to U.S. society. They're growing inequality of wealth. They're bad working conditions. Workers are suffering. They're working long hours. They don't have enough leisure time. They're not able to pursue education or other things such as the family outside of work because they're so involved in their work. And workers really didn't seem to have much power. There were unions, but often the unions were defeated by the owners and capitalists and by the political system that favored the capitalists over the workers. So Henry Demers Lloyd writes in Wealth Against Commonwealth that the government really has a job, a duty, a role to regulate big business by breaking up trusts and monopolies and restoring competition to the U.S. Economy and marketplace. And that this would be better for consumers, it would be better for small business owners, and it certainly would be better for workers. Moving on to women, and we can see there are 6 women listed. You see a picture of Florence Kelley, but Julia Lathrop, Florence Kelley, Ida Wells Barnett, Mary Church Terrell, sorry it's not March, but it's Mary Church Terrell, Charlotte Perkins, and Carrie Nation. Women get very involved, and this is really an exciting time for women as they begin to emerge from the shell of the household and domestic duties, which included, food preparation, clothing, making clothing, washing clothing, rearing children, changing diapers, educating children, all those things that go on in the home economy. Women now begin to step up and find a voice, and this is a really big change, and I think pretty significant, in fact, given that today half of our classes are filled with women, and women have aspirations to go on to college and secure good paying jobs, and they should. So let's take a look at Julia Lathrop and Florence Kelley. They both worked at the state level, and they worked in Illinois promoting really the creation of state charity funds that would help workers in times of unemployment and sickness. And they also promoted factory inspections to make sure working places were safer. Ida Wells Barnett organized African American women to push for anti-lynching laws at the federal level. Mary Church Terrell led the National Association of Colored Women, and she was promoting women's and women's issues, but also African American women issues in a time of intense segregation. In 1896, by parenthetical piece of information here, in 1896, the Supreme Court handed down one of the most controversial decisions in its history, Plessy versus Ferguson, which created the legalized practice of separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks. And we'll deal more with that later. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote Women in Economics in 1898, and her basic argument was women should seek economic independence by getting work outside the home, by relying on men doing more, but also hiring other women, to do the homework, but paying those women a working decent wage, so the professionalization of housework. And last, you see Carrie Nation. Her cause and crusade really was to end the consumption of alcohol in the United States. Alcohol had long been a staple of the United States, but Carrie Nation and others felt that it was destroying marriages, destroying families, and leaving too many families economically ruined because men spent their earnings on beer and alcohol at the saloons or bars. And the Reverend H.H. Russell founded the Anti-Saloon League to regulate saloons, and a group of women led by Carrie Nation organized what was known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union to stop the consumption of alcohol. She would succeed with the passage of the Volstead Act, which was then became the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, which did ban the sale of alcohol in the United States. So let's look at city and state reformers. We're going to look at first the city of Detroit and Hazen Pingree. You see him listed there or shown there on the left. He was a very active mayor in Detroit, and he believed in social justice through lower utility rates, electricity and water, and providing greater services to the people. In 1893, an English journalist came to Chicago during the Columbian Exposition, which was a World's Fair, a big deal, and he was shocked by what he saw in the slums of Chicago, and he wrote a book entitled If Christ Came to Chicago. And his thesis, or his argument, was Chicago needed a spiritual revival to clean up the city and get rid of corrupt politicians, dirty slums, and allow people a better quality, more human life. And the people of Chicago actually formed what was known as the Chicago Civic Federation, and they pushed for reforms at the city level, and their efforts were imitated in other cities. If we look at the states, we can find a really good example of a governor of the state of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, known as Fighting Bob La Follette, and he believed that the government had to attack political and social problems brought about by large-scale industrialization and big business, which had destroyed democracy. He, along with Theodore Roosevelt, who won election as governor of New York,